A thief attacked a pregnant woman on a bus, thinking he could get away with it. What he didn't realize was that Shaquille O'Neal was watching. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching us from. The bus groaned as it rolled through the rain-slicked streets, its wipers rhythmically scraping at the fogged-up windows. Lorraine sat near the middle, her body angled slightly toward the window as though trying to shrink into the cold glass. Her hands, calloused and rough from years of scrubbing and sweeping, rested protectively over her swollen belly. The faded scarf around her neck barely warded off the chill that seemed to seep in through the gaps in the bus doors. Her worn sneakers, once white but now a dull gray, shifted uncomfortably against the sticky floor. Outside, the autumn sky had surrendered to the relentless drizzle that turned the city into a blur of headlights and reflections. Inside, the bus was a cacophony of overlapping conversations, the hiss of wet clothing, and the occasional sharp note of a phone notification. The air was heavy with exhaustion, that peculiar collective fatigue of strangers heading home after long, grinding days. Lorraine closed her eyes, but the image of her late husband sprang to mind, unbidden and vivid. She remembered his laugh, the deep, reassuring sound of it, and the way he'd place his hand gently on her shoulder after a hard day. "We'll get through this, Lorraine," he used to say, but he wasn't here anymore. It had been 6 months since cancer took him, and each day since had felt heavier than the last. Now, the only solace she had was the tiny life growing inside her, kicking gently against her ribs as if reminding her to hold on. Her thoughts were interrupted by the loud, exaggerated laugh of one of the teenagers sitting across from her. They were a pair, both boys, dressed in baggy hoodies with earbuds hanging loosely from their necks. They weren't much older than 16, their eyes sharp with mischief. One of them nudged the other and nodded in her direction. "She's probably got, 5 kids already," the first one said, his voice carrying over the hum of the bus. "Nah, man," the second boy replied with a smirk. "She's still working on her basketball team. Bet you anything she's got a different baby daddy for each one." They laughed, the sound cutting through Lorraine like glass. She didn't move, didn't flinch. Years of enduring subtle and overt racism had taught her to build a wall between herself and the world's cruelty. But tonight, her wall felt thin, crumbling under the weight of her exhaustion. Her grip on her bag tightened, her fingers digging into the frayed straps as if holding on to it would anchor her somehow. A man in a tailored suit, sitting 2 rows ahead, turned slightly to glance at her, then shook his head with a condescending chuckle. "Pregnant and riding the bus this late," he said, just loud enough for those around him to hear. "Maybe you should have thought about your finances before bringing another mouth to feed into the world." The teenagers laughed even harder at that, one of them mimicking an exaggerated pout while cradling an imaginary belly. "Poor thing," he drawled mockingly. "Guess we should all chip in and help, huh?" Lorraine's vision blurred, not from tears, she refused to give them that satisfaction, but from the effort it took to suppress the anger and shame bubbling inside her. Her jaw clenched, and she turned her gaze out the window, watching the rain streak downward in erratic lines. She thought about all the things she wanted to say, the sharp retorts and cutting truths, but she swallowed them all. What was the point? She knew how this would go. If she defended herself, they'd only laugh harder, their cruelty feeding on her reaction. No one else on the bus said a word. Some passengers glanced at her briefly, their faces flickering with discomfort before they looked away. Others remained engrossed in their phones or stared blankly ahead, as though the scene unfolding was none of their concern. At the very back of the bus, sitting alone with his hood pulled low over his face, Shaquille O'Neal watched the entire exchange. His large frame nearly swallowed the seat, and his long legs stretched awkwardly into the aisle. He had positioned himself deliberately out of sight, hoping to avoid recognition. Even in the anonymity of a rainy evening, his towering height and distinctive build often drew attention he didn't want. Tonight, like Lorraine, he was tired. His body ached from a grueling training session, and all he wanted was to get home and disappear into the quiet of his apartment. But as he watched the scene unfold in front of him, something shifted. At first, he told himself it wasn't his business. He had learned long ago that intervening in every wrong he witnessed could be a thankless and exhausting task. Still, the sight of Lorraine, hunched over and trying to make herself invisible, reminded him too much of his own childhood. He remembered the taunts he'd endured, the way kids at school used to call him a freak because of his height, the way some adults had looked at him with suspicion simply because he was a young black boy in the wrong neighborhood. He glanced down at his hands, scarred and calloused from years of playing basketball. Those hands, once awkward and unsure, had become his strength. But what good was strength if he let it sit idle when it was needed most? The bus jolted to a stop, and the laughter up front died down momentarily as new passengers boarded. Shaquille adjusted his hood and leaned back against the seat, his mind racing. He wasn't ready to act, not yet. But he couldn't just sit there and let this continue either. Ahead of him, Lorraine shifted in her seat, her face pale and drawn. Her grip on her bag was white-knuckled now, and the boy's laughter seemed to echo in her ears long after it had stopped. The rain outside intensified, pounding against the windows like an impatient drumbeat. Lorraine closed her eyes again, breathing deeply, trying to steady herself. She didn't know how she was going to make it through the night. All she knew was that she had to. At the back of the bus, Shaquille watched her, his jaw tightening. He didn't know her name or her story, but he knew one thing for certain. She didn't deserve this. The bus screeched to a halt at the next stop, the sound of the brakes slicing through the damp, oppressive air inside. The doors hissed open, and a gust of cold autumn wind swept through the cabin, carrying with it the sharp tang of wet pavement and decay. A few passengers stepped off, umbrellas unfurling as they disappeared into the rainy night, while others boarded, shaking water from their coats and scarves as they found seats or grabbed onto the overhead rails. Among the new passengers was a man who seemed out of place even in the muted chaos of the crowded bus. His presence set off an unspoken tension that rippled through the cabin. He was young, perhaps in his late 20s, with a wiry build and darting eyes that refused to settle on any one thing for too long. His jacket was tattered, the zipper broken and hanging askew, and his hands were shoved deep into the pockets as though guarding some secret. His face was gaunt, with hollow cheeks and a sheen of sweat that glistened unnaturally under the dim fluorescent lights. Lorraine didn't notice him at first. She was too preoccupied with trying to regain her composure, her breath shallow and uneven as she stared out at the blurred cityscape. Her grip on her bag had loosened slightly, though it still rested securely on her lap, her fingers absently tracing the worn edges of its fabric. But the man noticed her. His eyes lingered on her for a moment too long, narrowing slightly as he assessed her. Shaquille noticed him too. From his vantage point at the back of the bus, he had an unobstructed view of the man's restless movements. Shaquille's years of navigating public spaces had honed his instincts for trouble, and this man radiated it. He wasn't just another weary commuter. He moved with a purpose that didn't fit the mundane rhythm of the bus. Shaquille leaned forward slightly, his massive hands gripping the edge of the seat in front of him as he watched the man weave through the crowded aisle. The bus lurched forward again, the sudden motion causing Lorraine to shift awkwardly in her seat. Her bag slid slightly to the side, and she adjusted it without thinking, the movement catching the man's attention. His eyes zeroed in on the bag, and for a split second, his expression hardened with resolve. He made his move quickly, too quickly for anyone to react in time. In one fluid motion, he reached out and yanked the bag from Lorraine's lap with such force that she barely had time to let out a startled gasp. The strap caught briefly on her wrist, but he jerked it free, the sudden violence of the act sending Lorraine sprawling sideways into the seat beside her. The sound of the scuffle snapped the bus into a stunned silence. Lorraine's gasp was followed by a sharp cry as she scrambled to regain her balance, her hands instinctively reaching out toward the man. "No, please stop. That's all I have," she pleaded, her voice breaking with desperation. The man didn't stop. He turned towards the doors, clearly intending to make a run for it at the next stop. But as he moved, his shoulder clipped the edge of a pole, throwing him off balance for just a moment. Lorraine, driven by sheer instinct and panic, lunged forward and grabbed at his sleeve. "Give it back!" she cried, her fingers clutching at the damp fabric. The man snarled, his free hand shooting out to shove her away. The force of the shove sent Lorraine tumbling backward, her body colliding with the edge of the seat. She cried out in pain, her hands instinctively flying to her belly as she curled into herself, her entire world narrowing to the frantic hope that her baby was unharmed. The scene unfolded in a matter of seconds, but to Lorraine, it felt like an eternity. Her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts at once, her keys, her ID, the small wad of cash she had painstakingly saved for groceries and the bus fare home. All of it was in that bag. Without it, she had nothing. The man didn't look back. He kept moving toward the doors, his movements hurried but calculated. The other passengers, frozen in shock, began to stir. A woman gasped audibly, clutching at her chest while a man muttered, "Somebody should do something." But no one moved. A teenager near the front pulled out their phone, tilting it to capture the scene on video, but their hands trembled and they didn't intervene. Shaquille didn't hesitate. As soon as the man had shoved Lorraine, something in him snapped. He rose from his seat with a purpose that was as massive as his frame, his shoulders brushing against the overhead rail as he stood to his full height. The passengers nearest to him shrank back instinctively, their eyes widening as they took in the sheer size of him. "Hey!" Shaquille's voice boomed through the bus, deep and commanding, cutting through the chaos like a whip crack. Every head turned toward him, including the man's, who faltered for a split second at the sight of the towering figure now advancing down the aisle. Shaquille moved quickly, his long strides eating up the distance between him and the thief in moments. The man hesitated, his body tensing as though considering whether to fight or flee. But before he could decide, Shaquille reached out and grabbed the strap of the stolen bag, yanking it back with enough force to nearly pull the man off his feet. "Let go," Shaquille said, his voice low and steady, the kind of tone that brooked no argument. The man struggled, twisting and jerking in an attempt to free himself, but it was futile. Shaquille's grip was unyielding, his strength far beyond anything the man could match. "I said, let go," Shaquille repeated, this time with a warning edge that made the man freeze. Slowly, grudgingly, he released the bag, his eyes darting around the bus as though searching for an escape. Shaquille stepped back, holding the bag securely in one hand, while keeping his eyes locked on the man. "You're done," he said simply, his tone final. The man glanced toward the doors, clearly contemplating making a run for it, but the driver, having been alerted to the commotion, had already activated the emergency lock. The doors remained firmly shut, and the driver's voice crackled over the intercom. "We're not going anywhere until the police get here." A murmur rippled through the bus as the other passengers began to process what had just happened. Some stared at Shaquille in awe, their expressions a mixture of relief and disbelief. Others shifted uncomfortably, their earlier inaction now a source of visible shame. Shaquille turned toward Lorraine, who was still hunched over in her seat, her face pale and her hands trembling. He knelt down beside her, his imposing frame shrinking slightly as he handed her the bag. "Here," he said softly, his voice losing its earlier edge. "It's yours." Lorraine took the bag with shaking hands, clutching it to her chest as though it were the most precious thing in the world. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't speak, her gratitude too overwhelming for words. Shaquille straightened and turned to face the rest of the bus. His gaze swept over the passengers, his dark eyes filled with something that was equal parts anger and disappointment. "You all saw what happened," he said, his voice resonating with quiet intensity. "You saw her get robbed. You saw her get shoved. And none of you did a damn thing." The silence that followed was deafening. Some passengers looked down at their laps, avoiding his gaze, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Shaquille shook his head slowly, his expression a mixture of disbelief and resignation. "If you don't stand up when it matters, you're just as bad as the person doing the harm." The bus remained silent as Shaquille returned to his seat, his presence looming over the stunned crowd. The thief sat near the front, subdued and cornered, while Lorraine tried to steady her breathing, her hands never leaving her bag. As the bus rolled on, the atmosphere inside had changed. The tension was still there, but now it was tinged with something else, a heavy, collective guilt that hung in the air like smoke. The bus moved forward at a steady pace, the occasional jolt of the uneven road causing Lorraine to sway in her seat. The grip on her bag had relaxed slightly, though her hands still clung to it as if letting go would invite disaster. The tears that had streaked her face had begun to dry, leaving faint trails on her cheeks. Despite the warmth inside the bus, a chill ran through her, her body still trembling from the shock of what had just occurred. She glanced down at her stomach, her hands instinctively moving to cradle her unborn child. The baby had kicked moments after she'd been shoved, as though sensing the danger and offering a small reminder that they were still connected, still surviving together. Her lips moved in a silent prayer of gratitude, though her heart remained heavy with the weight of the evening's events. Across the aisle, some passengers continued to avert their eyes, the earlier confrontation having left an awkward silence in its wake. A few people whispered among themselves, their words too quiet to decipher, but their sideways glances made it clear that Lorraine was the subject of their murmurs. Others stared straight ahead, their faces a mask of indifference or discomfort, as though willing themselves to forget what had just transpired. Lorraine let out a shaky breath and closed her eyes, trying to block out the oppressive atmosphere. But before she could lose herself in the rhythm of the bus, a shadow loomed over her. She opened her eyes to find the man who had come to her rescue, Shaquille O'Neal, standing in the aisle beside her. His expression was calm, but his eyes held a depth of concern that made her feel exposed, vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with the robbery. "You okay?" His voice was low, steady, the kind of voice that demanded an answer without being forceful. Lorraine nodded quickly, her throat tightening as she tried to speak. I'm fine," she managed to say, though the words felt hollow even to her own ears. Her hands moved to her belly again, a reflexive gesture that didn't go unnoticed by Shaquille. "You don't look fine," he said gently, kneeling down so that he was at eye level with her. The sight of such a large, imposing figure lowering himself in such a way caught her off guard. "You're shaking, and you were hurt. I saw him shove you." "I'm okay," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper, but the tears that welled up in her eyes betrayed her. She looked away, ashamed of her vulnerability, ashamed of the fact that she couldn't hold herself together after everything she'd already been through. Shaquille didn't press her. Instead, he leaned back slightly, giving her space but not leaving. "Look," he said after a moment, his tone softer now. "I know tonight's been rough, and I know you probably don't want to talk about it, but whatever's going on, you don't have to carry it alone." Lorraine shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. "You don't understand," she said finally, her voice cracking. "You don't know what it's like to be me." Shaquille tilted his head slightly, his dark eyes searching her face. "Maybe not," he admitted, "but I've been through my share of hard times. I know what it's like to feel like the world's against you, to feel like you're on your own." His words hung in the air between them, resonating in a way that Lorraine hadn't expected. She looked at him fully for the first time, taking in the lines of his face, the quiet strength in his posture. There was something about him that felt genuine, unshakable. Slowly, almost hesitantly, she began to speak. "I lost my husband," she said, her voice trembling, "6 months ago. Cancer. We didn't even know he was sick until it was too late. One day, he was fine, and then—" She trailed off, her hands tightening over her stomach. "Now, it's just me and the baby." Shaquille didn't interrupt, didn't try to fill the silence that followed. He simply nodded, his expression one of quiet understanding. "I'm working 3 jobs, Lorraine continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "Cleaning offices, scrubbing floors, doing whatever I can to keep a roof over my head, but it's never enough. Every month, I'm terrified I won't make rent, that I'll end up on the street with nowhere to go." Her words spilled out in a rush now as though a dam had broken. "And tonight was just too much. Losing my bag, losing the little money I had left. It felt like losing everything." She stopped, her breath hitching as tears streamed down her face. She didn't bother to wipe them away this time, didn't care who saw her crying. For once, the weight of her pain was too much to bear in silence. Shaquille reached out then, his large hand resting gently on the edge of her seat, close enough to offer comfort, but not so close as to overwhelm her. "I'm sorry," he said simply, "for everything you've been through. You didn't deserve any of it." Lorraine nodded, unable to speak, her throat tight with emotion. "But you're not alone," he continued, "not tonight. And not moving forward if I can help it." She looked at him then, her eyes wide with surprise and something else. Hope, faint but undeniable. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Why do you care?" Shaquille smiled faintly, a hint of sadness in his eyes. "Because someone once cared about me when I needed it most," he said, "and because it's the right thing to do." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The hum of the bus and the muted patter of rain against the windows filled the silence. Then, Shaquille reached into his pocket and pulled out a neatly folded envelope. He handed it to Lorraine, who hesitated before taking it. "What's this?" she asked, her voice wary. "Just a little help," he said. For groceries, bills, whatever you need to get through the next few weeks." Lorraine opened the envelope, her hands trembling as she saw the cash inside. It wasn't just a little help. It was enough to cover her rent and then some. She looked up at Shaquille, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to find the words to express her gratitude. "I can't take this," she said finally, shaking her head. "It's too much." "It's not," Shaquille said firmly. "And it's not charity either. It's a reminder that you're stronger than you think. But even the strongest people need a little help sometimes." Lorraine's tears flowed freely now, but they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. For the first time in months, the weight on her chest felt a little lighter. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Thank you so much." Shaquille nodded, his expression softening. "You're going to be okay," he said. "You and your baby. I believe in you." As the bus rolled on, the atmosphere inside began to shift. The passengers who had remained silent earlier now looked at Lorraine with something approaching compassion. A woman across the aisle leaned forward, offering her a tissue. An older man near the front nodded to her, his face etched with quiet regret. The weight of their earlier inaction seemed to hang over them, but for the first time they were trying to make amends in small but meaningful ways. For Lorraine, the change was subtle but profound. She still felt tired, still felt the weight of her struggles, but now there was a glimmer of something she hadn't felt in a long time. She wasn't alone. Not entirely. And for the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe that things might get better. The bus continued its journey through the rain-drenched city, its tires splashing through puddles that reflected the muted glow of streetlights. Inside, the air was heavy with an awkward silence, broken only by the occasional murmur or the distant sound of a phone notification. The earlier commotion had left its mark, a lingering tension that seemed to settle over the passengers like a thick fog. Lorraine sat quietly in her seat, her bag clutched tightly to her chest. Her tears had dried, but the raw emotions of the evening still clung to her like a second skin. The weight of Shaquille's words lingered in her mind, each one resonating with a truth she hadn't dared to acknowledge before. She wasn't alone, not entirely. And for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could change. Across the aisle, the other passengers began to stir, their earlier discomfort giving way to something more tangible. A woman in her 40s, dressed in a tailored coat and carrying a sleek leather purse, leaned forward and offered Lorraine a soft smile. "Are you okay, dear?" she asked, her voice gentle but filled with genuine concern. Lorraine hesitated, her grip on her bag tightening slightly. She wasn't used to strangers showing her kindness, not after so many months of being ignored or judged, but the woman's expression held no trace of pity, only understanding. Slowly, Lorraine nodded. "I'm okay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman nodded back, her smile widening slightly. "If you need anything, just let me know," she said, her tone warm. She sat back in her seat, her gaze lingering on Lorraine for a moment before turning to look out the window. Dot. The small gesture, though simple, sent a ripple through the bus. Others began to follow suit, their earlier indifference melting away in the face of Lorraine's quiet resilience. An older man near the front of the bus, his hands gnarled with age, shifted in his seat and cleared his throat. "Miss," he said, his voice rough but kind, If you need a seat that's more comfortable, you can have mine. I'll stand." Lorraine blinked, surprised by the offer. She glanced at Shaquille, who was still standing near the aisle, his gaze steady and encouraging. "Thank you," she said softly, though she didn't move from her seat. It wasn't about the gesture itself. It was about what it represented. For the first time in months, she felt seen. As the bus rolled on, the atmosphere began to shift further. Passengers who had earlier turned their backs now engaged in quiet, supportive conversations. A young man in his 20s, wearing a hoodie and holding a skateboard, leaned over to Shaquille. "That was cool, man," he said, his voice low but sincere. "What you did back there, not many people would have stepped up like that." Shaquille nodded, his expression calm. "It's not about being cool," he said. "It's about doing the right thing. We all have a responsibility to look out for each other." The young man nodded thoughtfully, his gaze drifting to Lorraine. "Yeah," he said, his voice softer now. "I get that." Lorraine watched the exchange, her heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. She hadn't expected any of this. Not the kindness, not the support, not the quiet solidarity that seemed to bloom in the aftermath of Shaquille's intervention. For so long, she had felt invisible, a mere shadow moving through a world that didn't care whether she sank or swam. But tonight, for the first time, she felt the faint stirrings of something she thought she'd lost. Hope. As the bus approached its next stop, Shaquille glanced at Lorraine. "This is me," he said, his voice low but firm. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a card, handing it to her. "That's my number. If you ever need anything, anything at all, don't hesitate to call. And if you're okay with it, I'd like to connect you with some people who can help. Housing, childcare, whatever you need." Lorraine took the card with trembling hands, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't even know how to thank you." "You don't have to," Shaquille replied, his tone gentle. "Just promise me one thing." Lorraine nodded, her gaze locked on his. "Anything?" "Promise me you'll keep going," he said. "For yourself and for your baby. You're stronger than you think, Lorraine. Don't ever forget that." The sound of the bus doors hissing open punctuated his words, and Shaquille straightened, his towering frame seeming even larger as he prepared to step off the bus. He glanced around at the other passengers, his gaze lingering for a moment on each face. "And the rest of you," he said, his voice carrying easily through the cabin, "remember this. It's not enough to sit back and watch. If you see someone in need, step up. Be better." The bus fell silent again, but this time the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was thoughtful, heavy with the weight of his words. As Shaquille stepped off the bus and disappeared into the rainy night, his figure fading into the mist, the passengers were left to ponder the impact of his actions. Lorraine watched him go, her heart full of emotions she couldn't quite name. Gratitude, certainly, but also something deeper, something that felt like strength. She glanced down at the card in her hand, her fingers tracing the printed letters as if memorizing them. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in months, she felt like she had a chance to face it with her head held high. The bus continued its journey, the rain outside softening to a gentle patter. The passengers, once silent and withdrawn, began to engage with one another in quiet conversations. An older woman offered Lorraine a seat by the window, while a young man helped her adjust her bag so it wouldn't slip again. The atmosphere, though still tinged with the residue of earlier tension, had shifted into something warmer, more human. Lorraine leaned back in her seat, her hands resting lightly on her belly. She felt the faintest flutter of movement, a reminder of the life growing inside her. She closed her eyes, letting the hum of the bus and the soft murmurs of conversation wash over her. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to hope, not just for herself, but for her child, for the future they would build together. As the bus neared her stop, Lorraine stood, her movements steadier now. She glanced around at the other passengers, offering a small smile to the woman who had spoken to her earlier and a nod of gratitude to the older man who had offered his seat. They responded in kind, their faces softening with a shared understanding. When the bus finally pulled to a halt, Lorraine stepped off into the cool night air, the rain now a light drizzle that kissed her skin. She looked up at the sky, the city lights reflecting off the low-hanging clouds, and took a deep breath. The weight on her chest had eased, replaced by a quiet determination. She wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing for certain. She would face it head-on, with her head held high and her heart full of hope. As she walked toward her apartment, the faint sound of the bus pulling away echoed behind her. She turned briefly, watching its red taillights disappear into the distance, and felt a surge of gratitude for the stranger who had stepped into her life when she needed it most. And for the first time in months, Lorraine allowed herself to smile. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more thought-provoking and inspiring stories. Share this video with your friends and family to spread its message, and check out our other videos to discover even more powerful tales. Your support means everything.